call the meeting to order and thank everyone for their attendance. To Chairman Edwards, it's always a pleasure to be with your wonderful school board, and we want to thank you and the school board for the great job you're doing on behalf of the city. I just thought about this as I sat down, ladies and gentlemen. This will be Jim Spore's last 5-year forecast. I mean, you're really going to miss this, aren't you, Jim? Okay. Farrell, are you going to start off, I gather? We welcome you.
Thank you, Mayor, members of the City Council and School Board, and good afternoon. Catherine and I will be tag teaming this presentation today. We'll be sharing some economic trends, some revenue projections, some expenditure projections. We'll put it all together for you at the end. We'll cover a few what-if scenarios, and finally we'll give you our conclusion. The economists tell us that things are getting better slowly. The State of the Region report indicates that the economy is getting better, with the gross regional product, or GRP, expected to increase by 1.27%. This is lagging behind the rest of the state at 1.56%, and the nation, which is at 2.39% growth, and that's 2014 to 2015. And we can expect more of the same. This slide shows other Virginia Municipal Service Areas, or MSAs. The Hampton Roads is not recovering as quickly as some others. Our largest revenue source for funding is real estate. The short sales and bank-owned sales are decreasing as a proportion of all home sales. For Virginia Beach, down from over 25% to roughly 15% of all sales. This has kept the appreciation of homes low. As these clear out, will help revenues grow. Another good thing is the number of bank-owned sales is also declining, even more than the owner short sales. These were homes that were selling for bargain basement prices. Median home values are also increasing, up 3.5% regionally, in Virginia Beach at 2.2%. The number of new homes sold regionally is up 18% after declining 54% from 2002 through 2010. Mortgage rates should remain even low. If the Federal Reserve Bank raises interest rates, it shouldn't affect us more than about 1%. Again, this slide, we're projecting to be back to a normal number of existing home sales, again reflecting the reduction of bank-owned and short sales. There were 600 in 2008, those number of distressed homes. There were peaked at 3,224 in November of 2010, and down to 1,592 in September of this year. The change in the real assessed value of real estate for 15 and residential was 1.9%, commercial was 1.8%. Projected in 16, 1.8% for residential and 3.9% for commercial. And through the rest of the years of the forecast, about 2.5%. Consumer confidence is up, real disposable income is up, and household spending is up. As you can see on this slide, the trend is becoming more positive, as anything around the 90% is considered good. Thank goodness for low inflation over the past few years, and you can see the trend there. This slide is from the Federal Reserve and just showing that household net worth is up. You lost the slide? Okay. Okay. Well, anyway, it's trending up. Okay. Did we lose an? Is
We
it
lost the
showing
other one
there?
too.
This invisible slide, and it is in your packet, it does show that both disposable income, personal consumption, and expenditures have been trending up. Here you see the trend is up over the past 3 years for both Virginia Beach and the U.S. regarding median household income. Finally, there is a federal budget. The last time was in 1997. This budget increases both defense budget and non-defense spending. But even with this increase, our region will still be at 3.2% lower in DoD spending than it was in 2012. The percent of our regional GRP attributable to the DoD spending has declined from 44.9% to 39.3%. The good news is that our economy has diversified, just not due to the increase in private sector, but rather due also to contraction in the defense sector. The debt ceiling was also raised until 2017. There's been a 2-year patch, if you will, attributed to sequestration regarding the defense spending based on the just approved federal budget. And just to help you with the sources there, the BCA is the Budget Control Act, the BBA is the Bipartisan Budget Act, and the BA is the Budget Act. Those are the sources of this slide's information. Here you see that the gross regional product at 44.9% in 2011 and down to 33.9% in 2015. The region has made up 18,000 of the 40,000 jobs lost, but most restored jobs are not as well-paying jobs as we've lost. It will take another 7 years to restore all jobs lost during the recession. That would be evenly split at 20,000 private sector jobs and 20,000 military jobs. The labor force participation rate has leveled off at 61%. As a number of folks in the labor force decreases and the number of jobs continues to grow, there will be increased pressure on wages. Unemployment rate, is this not showing up? It's in the handout there, but it's trending down. Currently, in 15, it will be at 5.1%, and over the next few years, 4.8%. The unemployment rate, the U.S. is at 5%, Virginia at 4.3%, and Virginia Beach at 4.6%. And now I'll turn the presentation over to Kathy.
Thank you, Pharaoh. Catherine, we welcome you.
Hopefully it didn't eat all my slides too. So my task is to kind of go over some of the major revenue streams that we share with the city and schools between us through the formula, go over some of our expenditure projections for the next 5 years, kind of tie it all together and talk about some alternative scenarios to some of our key assumptions. Revenue assumptions going forward. These are based totally on trend. The graph you'll see on revenues, there's no assumed tax increases or major fee adjustments embedded in the forecast of the revenue streams. No use of fund balance with the exception of the $10 million that the city will be using to cover its Southeastern Public Service Authority revenue loss. This is an issue we've talked to the city council, and I think I've mentioned it in previous forecast, where we have a short-term loss of revenue as we go through that process of redoing the agreement between the regional cities. The schools does have some reversion money. It's not embedded in the forecast, but it can cover approximately half of the deficit that we'll talk about at the end. After reviewing the federal budget cap legislation and understanding that it is kind of front-loaded into 2017, we made minimal, if any, adjustments to our revenue streams. Federal revenue for the city is relatively small, predominantly in the Department of Housing and Neighborhood Preservation and in the Human Services Department. We'll get a better understanding of how those monies will flow to those programs more into the spring as we put the budget together. For the schools, their biggest revenue from the federal government is federal impact aid, and the school system does expect that to decrease about $1.5 million going into 17. I don't know, some of you I know have seen this graph before. This is decade growth rates for the city revenue streams. You can see, and of all the things I'll go over, this is probably the most telling as to why we're struggling at this point. Back in the good old days of the 80s and 90s, we were seeing 13.8%, nearly 14% revenue growth on average. That was really the heyday of the city. We had a really growing population. We were building houses, building schools. So there was a lot of churn in our economy, and that was helping our revenue generation. Going into the 90s, heading into the 2000s, you see that drops to about 9.4%. Still growth in students, growth in population driving the economy. We hit the 2010. We're heading into the recession. This is really, the only way we hit 4.8 was a lot of the home valuation running up into the bubble. We hit the actual recession years of 2010 through 14. We actually saw negative revenue growth over that 5-year period. And looking out into the forecast, we're only going to see about a 1.5, maybe 2% growth rate going into the future. Going into real estate tax revenue, I want to kind of orient you to what you're going to see on these revenue graphs. The blue line is the budgeted numbers. When it hits the dash, that's the projection out into the future. The yellow is what we actually collected based on the CAFRs. So you can see from this that we're pretty good at predicting housing assessments and housing revenue. It's fairly stable. Things don't move around on us too much, so we pretty much nailed that one with the help of the assessor's office. The rate adjustments are showing on the slide for the last 3 times the council raised or lowered tax rates. The revenue, real estate revenue is projected to grow by about 2.5%, as Farrell said, going into the future. Which results in 2017 of a $9.7 million increase in that one revenue stream. This is our largest single revenue source for city and school funding at the local level. Moving on to personal property tax. This is our second largest group of revenues and is comprised predominantly of taxes on vehicles. You can see from the little pie chart at the top, these 2 pies are vehicles. They add to about 79% of the total revenue base is related to cars and the assessment of cars. Again, you can see that we missed personal property tax revenue. This is a little bit harder for us to predict. Cars are a little more mobile. We had anticipated some recovery in the recession in those early years, 2013, 2014. Which made us a little more optimistic in terms of the projection. We missed budget. We overcompensated in 2015. Actuals actually exceeded budget in that year. As we seek to correct this, we think we're going to get it. We hope we're going to get it pretty close in 16 and going into 17. 17, we're projecting about a 1.5% growth in this revenue stream, and that would generate about $3.8 million to the city and school system. Restaurant meals generates about $38.7 million in the current year to support our programs. Restaurant meals continued to see growth through the recession, and now coming out of it, they were still seeing growth. We are fairly close on making the estimate to actual calculation. Going into 17, it should generate about another $2.6 million. And right now, we think we'll probably be a little bit low on our budget for 16, may exceed revenue slightly there. I didn't mention it, but we gave you on your slides, what each 1% or what 10% jumps in the actual rates would generate in terms of revenue, just for information. Sales tax, the top portion here, general sales, is shared with the city and school system through the formula. The state's total rate is 6 cents. 1% of that is local and comes back to the city. As can be seen by the graph, collections miss budget in the last 2 fiscal years by roughly $1.6 million each year. We had mentioned this previously. The state had estimated a huge benefit from the Amazon distribution center opening in Middle Virginia. We thought our proportionate share would be about $1.6 million. The state didn't realize its revenue. We didn't get ours. So we did miss budget in those 2 years. But we think that we're on track to catch up. 2017 has an estimate of $59.8 million in general sales tax, and it's about a 3% growth every year thereafter. The bottom part of the chart is state share sales tax. This is a revenue directly to the school system. It's computed by the state as 1.125% of the state's portion of sales tax revenue. It goes to the Department of Education and then comes back to the school system through a calculation based on student enrollment. As you can see, the two really don't track in line, and I think it's that calculation on student enrollment that the Department of Education does. But you can see growing forward, that's growing at about 2% a year. So if you add up all the revenues that will support the city and school system, you can see that we're growing by about $21 million into 17. Most of the revenues that are embedded in the formula and really support the city and schools are growing over the forecast period. We have some kind of spectacular children that aren't doing so well, but they're not really big revenues. Cigarette taxes, even with the recent tax increase, we're predicting to continue its downward slope. The only time that revenue has made budget or has increased has been when we've had a rate increase. We had one just this year. One of the interesting things about cigarette taxes, I don't know how much y'all know about how it's collected. We actually sell stamps to the wholesaler, and the wholesaler puts stamps on each individual package or pack of cigarettes. Normally, on a month-to-month basis, that sales of stamps is about $1 million in revenue to the city. Knowing that the council had raised taxes effectively on July 1st, the wholesalers came in June, we saw a $3 million sale of stamps. Double what we'd seen on an average on a monthly basis. So we probably won't make budget in cigarette taxes in 16. The other ones that are coming down are telecommunication taxes. Ever since the state took that over, we've seen a declining revenue in that revenue section. There's been a couple of big issues in terms of the major phone companies coming in and asking for exonerations that have resulted in some big exonerations into the revenue stream. The other thing that's happened, and y'all may have done it, is the dropping of landlines and going to solely using cell phones. That's also impacting that revenue stream. Interest income has continued to underperform since the recession. We used to get about $20 million. That's hovering at about $2 million now in the budget. It's really going to be tied to the Federal Reserve raising interest rates. Hopefully it'll do a little better, but because interest rates have been about 0%, we're not getting much money off of that. Schools revenues in total are projected to grow about 0.5% going into 2017, pulling down the general fund's growth of about 2.2%. The combined growth rate is 1.6% into the first year of the forecast. But before I wanted to leave revenues, I did want to touch base on the school funding streams. It's important to understand that the city school revenue sharing formula, which provides the local contribution to schools, has been growing even with declining student enrollment. It's not tied to student enrollment. As those revenue streams recover, that's a growing revenue source for the schools. It does appear, based on some stuff we're hearing out of the General Assembly, that the governor's budget, which will come out mid-December, may have some additional money for early childhood education. Hopefully full-day kindergarten has been a priority for him, so we'll wait to see how that pans out when the budget comes out. Were notified yesterday, and I shared it with Farrell, or Farrell already had it, that the composite index may be dropping. That may mean less money required from the city, but more money coming in from the state. If the whole pie for state funding to education goes up, then our proportionate share through the formula will also increase, even with the drop in the composite index. Switching over to expenditures. Key assumptions for expenditures are no pay increases after the 1.34% that's planned for the final year of the VRS mandated phase-in. That's in both the city and schools assumptions, but after that, no additional increases. There's a 5% increase in the employer's contribution for health care, and I'll go over that in a little more detail. There's a VRS contribution increase planned for the city and school systems over the 5 years. Operating cost increases are based basically on inflation, with the exception of fuel and debt service, and I'll go over those in a little more detail. Demand for services, it's really the meat and butter of what we do. Meat and butter, that's not the right analogy. Yeah. you understood. It's delivering services that are desired by our community, be they school services or city services. You can see the demand for services index, which is something the Management Services Department has been keeping up with, has been increasing. It's up about 77% since 2000 even. If there had been no increase in demand, if it was only going up by population and inflation, it would have been relatively flat at 100%. So we are controlling for those two factors. Salaries and fringes. This is over $1 billion in expenditures when you combine the city and schools payroll. It adequately compensates our 14,000 plus staffs for the excellent work they do, especially in face of rising demands and restricted funding. And it is of monumental importance as we look at the budget. It's important to note that these costs are increasing not because of pay, because I remember I said no pay increase after the 2017 number. The increases are being driven by pension costs and health insurance costs. So if you look at the two bars or two lines on this graph, health insurance is the blue line. It's anticipated to continue to rise over the forecast period. Medical trend in the city self-insured health insurance program, city and school self-insured program, is running at about 8% increase year over year. However, the employer's contribution, which is what is shown here, is only projected to increase at 5%. That will mean that employee premiums will have to bear the additional cost of that 8% medical trend. We're working with the Benefits Executive Committee to look for ways to reduce medical trend, try to bend that curve. The Schools Benefits Office just put in place a new wellness program, which hopefully help people stay healthier and help bend that curve. VRS contributions are projected to increase. That's the yellow line. Interesting, late on Friday, we learned that the VRS employer's contribution for the city wouldn't be necessarily going up. It may be going down. It may be going down significantly. We're trying to find out from VRS exactly what that's going to mean, partly because we have an unfunded liability within the city's pension fund, and it's hard to believe, if the information I got just before I came in here, we were at 75%, now we're at 78% funded, why they would reduce our rates and not look for that unfunded liability to be better covered. So we're working with VRS on trying to understand that. We should get final rates from them, official rates, in January. Looking at our operating cost, the paper, the fuel, the utilities, equipment's needed by both systems to operate day to day. These are projected to increase by 2%. Beyond simple supply accounts are debt service paid to support the capital improvement program of both systems and transfers to other funds. Transfers in the general funds portion of this graph are about $55 million, and it's transferred out of the general fund to support things like the sheriff's fund, the non-dedicated portion of the Parks and Recreation Fund. So that's the biggest portion. Also transferred out of the general fund, and you notice some of my slides say net of the city school transfer. That's a $400 million transfer, but to make the numbers comparable, we netted it out as we do in the operating budget itself. Looking at price of fuel, the blue line is the national fuel prices, and the yellow line is what the city has been paying. It's a combined diesel and gas price, so it looks a little higher than you probably were used to seeing. You can see that the city right now is paying about $2.24 a gallon on a combined diesel fuel. Our gas prices are $1.50 per gallon that we've been buying on the spot market. We currently expect that to continue. National economists expect the price of oil to remain under $50 into the next year, which is good. If you think back to the $3.94 a gallon days, oil was trading substantially above $100 at that point per barrel. Looking at debt service for the city and schools, the city's debt service is the green line, the school's debt service is the yellow line. The city's debt service is projected to increase based on utilizing the existing charter bond capacity to construct roads and buildings and bridges. This equates to roughly $42 million each year. This chart does not include debt service on major projects or utility infrastructure, or those paid by dedicated funding and other funds. The school's debt service is projected to decline over the forecast period as older debt is paid off or refinanced at lower interest rates that we're enjoying. This chart does not assume new debt to the school system. For an enhanced modernization program, I know that's something that the Modernization Committee will be looking at. If the school's use of debt service remains at its current $32.3 million, it will decline as illustrated on this graph. Combining all the different expenditures for expenditures included in the city and school funding formula. And in the back of the report is the detailed forecast for both the city and school system. You can see that expenditures are expected to increase by about 3.7% before leveling off over the forecast period. That leveling off is being caused by the assumption of no pay raises predominantly, as well as the decrease in debt service for schools. One thing I wanted to leave you with is looking at the region. I know the school board's kind of used to seeing expenditures per student. This is expenditures per capita. It allows us to use the state's auditor of public accounts report to do a comparison across the region. It also kind of factors into the fact that the parents are the ones that are paying it, so seeing it on a per capita basis kind of makes it an understandable comparison. We are among the lowest providers in the region of both city and school services. So putting it all together, I want to put the revenues and expenditures together and then test a few key assumptions. Sorry for these graphs, they're a little on the busy side. This is the school's forecast up here. This is the city's base forecast down here. The city's deficit, I'll start down here, starts in 17 at about $15 million and increases over the year to about 18.5 by the time you get out to the final year. Schools, on the other hand, are in a deficit of about $16 million in the first year of the forecast, about 19, assuming no pay raise, and the drop in debt service, they would start to show a positive balance, growing to a positive $18.4 million in the future. That's everything holding true. The schools would start to see some positive balance starting in 19. I'm not sure everything will hold true, though. Base expenditures, the projected deficit combined is $31.3 million. The thing I'd want you to note about this graph is it combines city revenue, city expenditures, school expenditures. So in a way, we're negating part of the city's deficit by using the school's surplus in the out years, but this is more for illustrative purposes. That is not something that can happen going forward. But I wanted to show you kind of what would happen if we change the revenue assumption to more positive and the revenue assumption to more negative, or what would happen if we put in a small pay increase. So the purpose of these lines is not that this is the reality, but this is, you'll see that this is very hard to sustain, but it's not something we could actually do. So on every graph that follows, you'll see these same two lines. Expenditures are the green dots, revenue is the yellow dots, and the change in revenue will be a solid yellow line, and the change in expenditures will be a solid green line. So with that set up, we started by identifying the 5 worst years for revenue growth in the city, which obviously would be the recession. No economist that we've talked to would indicate that in the next 5 years we're going to see that kind of a nightmare again. So what we said was, what happens if we have no revenue growth? We're only at 1.5%, 1.6% in revenue growth anyway. So it's within reasonable assumptions that we could actually see a flat revenue growth scenario. So instead of our revenue growing by the dotted lines, you'd see it stays flat. We would lose $21 million in revenue if we had the same revenue as we had in 16, and nearly $120 million in revenue by the time we got out to this level. But it would take a major economic shift to see this happen over the next 5 years. And we'd certainly have trouble sustaining city and school services. So what happens if revenue was a little better? We started by looking at the 5 highest years of revenue growth, which were the pre-recession years with the housing bubble run up. We were seeing 7.5 for the city, 6.7 for the schools. We were able to accomplish a lot of things. Council was able to reduce the tax rate and still attain those kind of growth. Again, this is unlikely over the forecast period. I wish I could stand up here and tell you I see that happening, but I don't. So what we said is, what if we said it was going to be 2% better than what we thought? So we thought revenue would be growing about 1.6, 1.5. What if it's 3.5? You can see on the graph, here's our base level revenue growth. This is our 3.5 revenue growth. You can see that in the first year, the deficit would essentially be eliminated. And then we'd have a surplus out here in these years. One thing we noted in the forecast report is that we need to be able to give a reasonable pay increase, to be able to expand services where we have high demand areas, and to look to doing more things or different things, all-day kindergarten, whatever it was we thought we needed. We need about 4 to 5% revenue growth, and that's been pretty consistent. We are not getting it. We don't see us getting it over the forecast period, and we're talking about looking for efficiencies, looking for low-hanging fruit services to eliminate, looking for minimal pay raises for our staff going forward. The final thing I want to show you is kind of what happens if we change just the expenditure side of the equation. What if we gave a 1.66% pay raise in addition to the 1.34 that's in the base forecast, and then carried a 1.66 every year thereafter? That's not quite keeping up with inflation, but it does do something to help the employees. It certainly doesn't keep up with the rising cost of health care for them. But you can see if we do a 1.66% pay raise, the deficit gets $15 million worse in the first year, and by the time you get out here, you have a $75 million increase to your deficit in the out years. So in conclusion, the budget will be balanced when you all receive it. I've tried to get the state law changed. They won't let me. I've tried to get the mayor to sit for pictures. He won't do it either. So we will be balanced. Farrell and I will work with y'all and with the staffs to make all the decisions necessary to balance the budget when it's presented to y'all. We have managed through greater deficits during the recession. One year we managed through a $90 million deficit, so $31 million will be hard, but not impossible. It is a long time between now and when we present the budgets. A lot of things can change. We talked about VRS. We talked about the composite index, what the governor's budget will do when it comes out. All of those things are constantly evolving. I think the thing we'd like to leave you with is it is getting better. One day I'd like to stand up and say we have extra money, but I don't see that happening in the next 5 years. And with that, we'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Farrell and Catherine. Questions or comments, please? Good presentation.
And I want to integrate my comments along with the written report that we received, because I think we start off with some false choices. And if you look at our reference to page 4, Mr. Mayor, where it talks about, and it says, that while other funds make up a significant portion of the budget, that's all these trustee accounts, that's the TIF fund, Materials Growth Investment Fund, that's this new multimodal light rail mistake fund. All these things are not considered as being on the table because of policies are already in place. Well, 6 votes on city council can change all those policies, so they very much are in play. And we should be looking at the total resources. We should be looking at the carry forward surpluses in all those accounts. To what extent this city council is willing to harvest those accounts to deal with some of the more stressing things that we're dealing with. So I think it is a false choice to take them off the table and not to address and look at the ability to change policies that would take existing revenue streams rather than saying, I can't make my budgets meet, and implicitly throughout this document is a sales pitch for tax and fee increases despite the assumptions. That is the implicit underlying tone. So I think, first of all, Mr. Mayor, all the resources that we have should be on the table, and we should be willing to consider changing policies that we have. Now, the other thing that we consistently do in these reports is look at nominal valuations versus constant dollars. And I know you have heard me year after year constantly talk about it, but we continue to do it. But I invite your attention to page 8, which also translates to the average price per gallon of gas. And this shows you why it's important to do constant dollar pricing. If you take the consumer residential price of $2.84 in 2007 and just use CPI, but I realize there's lots of things that deal with gas, but it does talk about people's money, and then you carry that forward, the price of gas in 2014 would have been slightly higher. Not much, but slightly higher. It just shows the impact, it would have on consumers. So, but I realize gas prices have changed, and it all depends. Obviously, the wholesale tax changed because as gas prices fell, the amount that they paid in tax didn't change. And so that changed the fluctuation, and that may explain the difference. But the most telling example of that is when we deal with median household income. Now, I think all of us have heard statistics and analysis, I don't care if it's Brookings Institute or Heritage or Cato, have told us what? That middle class, that's a broad definition, has had stagnant wages for over 2 decades. So clearly, people's purchasing power has not changed. So if you look at that graph that talked about median household income, you would show that between 2006, and of course the dollar value didn't go on there, so I had to interpolate a little bit, but I would suggest adding it. The real family income, if it kept pace with the CPI, which the definition of that has changed over time, would be $3,181 higher. So in fact, the median family, that's 50% of our 165,000 households, has less purchasing power today than they had in 2006. And when you do that kind of CPA analysis to the city's budget in 2006, it's gone up in real terms. The only way that happens is we've distributed private income and wealth from the private sector to the public sector. Nowhere does this analysis reflect that. And if you go back, and I think this is important because these are the real heavy discussions, because when we look at that delta, the delta can't come from the residents. The delta has to come from fiscal policy changes that we have, and I think it means we have to revisit these trust funds. I think we have to revisit some decisions we've already made of misuse of income. But look at this change in employment between low wage versus high wage. That's on page 12 of the report. And if you look at all the things that have declined and you look at what's up, but you don't have the actual numbers, but when you look at the average private sector wage that we have in our bond prospectus, published average weekly wage, in real terms that has gone down over the same period. We are less wealthy today to pay for the government that we have than we were in 2006. Nowhere do I hear an acknowledgement or any assessment in this report that acknowledges that. It's only in terms of using nominal statistics, which belie the fact of the underlying trends in the overall economy, could you begin to say that people's real disposable income is up. I haven't been meeting those families. I don't know, they're the mythical families, but I haven't been meeting them in my tours around the city. People are struggling, very much so. And so I think this is, glosses over. And when we say our tax sales missed budget, that's $160 million worth of transactions. Well, every time we raise taxes and fees, we reduce the disposable income of people to spend in the private sector.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to infer that the tax sales missed budget. I meant to infer that we overestimated the sales that didn't. end
Right,
up
but if you go back and
materializing. But we had a
control-
reason for that.
Yeah, but if you go back and look, and I've done that, and I'll show you, go back and do a constant CPI, you will see that in real terms, our sales taxes have not been moving up, only in nominal terms. Nominal terms. And as you know, we have a less per capita sales tax in Chesapeake for a reason none of us truly yet understand. I wish I could explain it, but it's real. But the point being is, this report has been my criticism from day one, talks a lot about the city as an artificial entity. You know, I could do a household thing and say my demand for services from my teenager or my wife, and I could come up with an index too and say it's grown, but my income hasn't, right? Everyone can create an artificial index or even a real index that's not tempered by price. And when there's no discipline on demand, the demand is artificial. It's easy to say, I have more, but the average resident doesn't have more to pay. So that's why I think we have not done the job we should have done to assess the financial health of the city. Is great. We are not addressing the financial health of our households to carry this forecast, even without increases.
And this report, purpose of the report has never been to assess the health of the family. I believe the council did get a briefing on the health of the Virginia Beach family earlier this year, and I'm happy to get another copy out there. It did physical, fiscal, as well as criminal activities that involve our families. It was several months ago, though, but I'm
I
happy
saw
to get
that
it.
report. It did not deal with the disposable income. Talked about lots of things, but not the capacity of people to pay. And so I don't need to get that again. I do have that.
Okay.
But as you look through here, I think these statistics, what do they mean? And also it says about the debt service, excluded all the debt we issued through the Development Authority. I think we need to see a chart with all the debt, because in reality, that other debt, Mr. Mayor, is paid by my garbage fee, by my water fee. You know, there's a lot of that debt.
There are utility debt that's out there, and it's about $200 million in debt that the utility departments pay. But the predominant amount of debt is general government debt, as you know.
But my point being is, all that debt is still being supported by the same households who are paying those fees. And those enterprise accounts, as I understand it, are not located in the numbers that we see.
No, we focused on the two accounts that generally involve the majority of city services. Utility accounts, because they are business accounts, do have to balance within those funds, and the policy choices, they are limited there for council to make.
Right,
changes.
but when we talk about compensation, those funds also have to bear the cost of
Yes,
those
they do.
compensation increases, which translates often into what? Increases in fees to pay those labor costs. So how can you look at it, you're a citizen, and say a 5-year forecast and say, what really is the 5-year forecast? Well, if I adopt all those scenarios, there's impact on those utility
yes.
accounts, and we're not getting a total resource picture. And so therefore, when we're looking, we're not just spending this money, we're also spending a lot of money. And so I think in the future, and I'll say again, we need to be looking at these over our constant dollars, not nominal dollars, to really have a better understanding of the financial stress that's on our families. And when someone says full-day kindergarten, I know that always sounds attractive. It's like, like national health care. No one wants to pay for it. But there's
a lot of
huge
things we don't wanna pay for,
implications
but
on the
we want.
capital improvement program of that. There's major impact on our debt service capacity from that. So the fact that the governor is might stroke a check, I'm sure it will be less than what it would really cost us. Forget about the capital service. So I think we need to be careful and more measured about that scenario, what that really means to the council, to the public, in terms of the financial burden. If we're going to do that, what else are we choosing not to do? Otherwise, what I hear through this thing is, and who thinks we're not going to give employees pay raises over 5 years? Raise your hand if you think that's true. So automatically, how artificial does that make this report? Very artificial. So we really say, what do we really want to do? What do we think we need to do? Let's show that line, and let's be honest with the public how we're going to pay for it. Well, let's make sure that we're looking at all those trust funds. Let's make sure we're looking at all the things we've committed to, and then tell the public. So I think this document is artificial, and it's not giving the public a realistic picture of what the future looks like.
And I
those are
think
my
this has always
observations.
been kind of the kickoff for a long process.
All right, thank you, John. Anybody else have any questions or comments? I would just say to you that I have found this information beneficial for many years, and at the same time, I want to applaud the school board and the council and all the both staffs for doing it. Secondly, we do have another gap that we're going to have to deal with, and I would just sit back and say to you, we've gotten through it before, and we'll find a way to get through it again by working together, and that's what we've been able to do for a number of years, and so we'll conclude on that. Look forward to
Thank you.
the budget process next year. Thank y'all for coming over.